Hello, Lagim fam. Before we start with today's case, I would like to let you know that I have another podcast called Asia in the Shadows. It is a weekly true crime podcast that features crime stories from all over Asia. I have featured some truly terrifying stories from countries such as Japan, Hong Kong, Macau, and Indonesia. So, if you want to take a true crime trip all over Asia with me, come join me on Asia in the Shadows every week on a Wednesday on your preferred podcasting platform. Okay, now on to the episode. We are all familiar with the story of Helen of Troy, right? The face that launched 1,000 ships, started a war between Troy and Greece, all because her beauty was so captivating that men were willing to kill each other for her. Of course, the story is very much steeped in mythology, the understanding of women being property of their husbands, and perhaps Greece's political hubris. Whilst our story does not center around a kind of modern Helen of Troy, it was the premature death of a woman that triggered the downfall of a man who considered himself to be divine and above all others. The woman's death prompted a good look at a religious group whose headquarters is tucked away on a small island to the west of the Philippines. A group with its own version of La Sagrada Familia, who dominated not only the religious but also the political landscape of that area. A family who thought of themselves as infallible and perhaps invincible as well. This is the story of Ruben Ecleo Jr., leader of the Philippine Benevolent Missionary Association Incorporated, or PBMA. Mabuhay! Welcome to another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. My name is Christine Abrigana and I am your host. If you are new here, thank you for stopping by and make sure to follow this podcast on social media and on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Links to these sites are in the show notes. If you want to support this podcast, make sure to check the show notes as well for further information. As usual, please note that some details in this episode can be triggering for some people, so please take care of yourself whilst listening. In order to understand the PBMA and Ruben Ecleo Jr. himself, one needs to look at the man who was instrumental in establishing the group, Ruben Ecleo Sr. Ecleo Sr. was born into a rather poor family on the 9th of December 1934 on the island of Cabilan. According to Ecleo Sr. himself, he started traveling to mostly smaller towns in central Philippines at the age of 8, assuming different names. He called himself a transient healer and missionary. As a budding spiritual leader, he claimed to have had the ability to communicate with spirit guides and to know Arabic, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Sanskrit. The knowledge of these mostly ancient languages apparently allowed him to also read the so-called Akashic records, a sort of collection of things and events from past, present, and future that are stored in a higher dimension called Akasha. The odd thing about these claims is that Ecleo Sr. never actually demonstrated these language skills, but his followers were and are still of the belief that Ecleo's claims were true. With the mention of Akasha, you can probably deduce that the PBMA is not a strictly dogmatic Christian group. Rather, it draws its core beliefs from different religions such as Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, and of course, Akasha. Now, the PBMA was established in 1965 by Moises Ecleo, Ruben Sr.'s brother. Moises called himself Divine Master, and Ruben Sr. did not let that slide without some more claims about himself as well. Apart from the claims I've already mentioned, he also claimed to be able to heal the sick and revive the dead. Furthermore, in 1963, just 2 years before the PBMA was founded, Ecleo Sr. was elected as mayor in the local elections on the Dinagat Islands, a position that he would hold for around 2 decades, making him, in essence, not only a spiritual, but also a political leader with a lot of sway and influence on the islands. It is not entirely clear if there had been an internal power struggle between the brothers, but Ruben Sr. would eventually be recognized as the group's leader. Officially, the PBMA is described as a non-sectarian and non-profit charitable religious organization that has a huge following in Visayas and Mindanao. But that is only the surface. One has to understand the group's basic belief premises to understand how it became the influence that it is now in both Visayas and Mindanao. So, what are the basic premises of the PBMA's beliefs? The group, which now boasts a membership of around 3 million people nationwide, believes in a triune God, much like the Christians believe in the Trinity. However, PBMA followers believe that Ruben Sr. is God the Father, also called Divine Master or Worshipful Master, but also the Holy Spirit. Ruben Jr., the Son, is believed to be therefore God's Son and the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. The followers of PBMA also believe in different spirit guides who serve to guide Ruben Sr. The group also teaches, amongst other things, salvation and how to attain it. You'd first have to become an active member of the group and receive the membership ring, which will be used on Judgment Day. If you are wearing this said ring, you'd be granted access to heaven. If not, it is a one-way ticket to hell. Also, to ensure salvation, PBMA followers are told to do good, to participate in PBMA activities, including attending meetings for which an entrance fee is demanded. The receipts given to the members after paying for this entrance fee are usually kept by the members so they have evidence to show that they are deserving of salvation. And naturally, I had to ask, who would be the judge of this? Well, according to PBMA's beliefs, it is Ruben Ecleo Jr. The group also believes on some level in reincarnation and in heaven and hell. They believe that heaven is a physical place specifically located under the deep sea of Surigao, and that hell can be accessed through one of Ecleo's houses. However, one of the most important parts of the group's beliefs is the power of healing and how group members are able to heal others. Filipinos locally and abroad have been enthralled by the group's seemingly ability to heal. This drew the crowds in and eventually led them to becoming new members. Members and those who are still on the fence are told that the source of the group's healing powers was Ruben Sr. With this belief in a healing power came other related practices such as operation using hands, hypnotism, sorcery, mind reading, and even fortune telling. On a whole, the outside observer is allowed to have whatever opinion they may want to have about the group. However, one must also not underestimate the group altogether as a collective force who is loyal to their leadership. But more to this later. Ruben Sr. would stay in both politics and the PBMA until his death in 1987. Many might wonder how he was able to stay in power for so long, or how on earth does a small ragtag group, as the Philstar publication called it 2 decades ago, evolve into this power hold on the Dinagat Islands. I suppose partially the answer to that is timing. When the group was first formed, they helped fight communist guerrilla fighters and Muslim secessionists between the 60s and 70s in both Visayas and Mindanao. The group naturally endeared themselves not only to the local people, but to local government authorities. In fact, most of the earlier PBMA members belonged to the Ilagas, a Christian militia group which figured prominently in the military campaign against the MNLF, or the Moro National Liberation Front. Aside from being quite instrumental in fighting off communist rebels and the MNLF back then, the PBMA did not look bad on the surface, at least initially. The group promoted a so-called clean living, telling the members to avoid alcohol and cigarettes, also telling their male members specifically to not go womanizing. Sounds reasonable, right? The PBMA as a group has its own quirks as well, like most religious groups out there. These are not necessarily disturbing ones, but they do raise eyebrows. For example, members have a small libreta, a little booklet, which is supposed to contain Latin inscriptions believed to be prayers that could save them from harm. Aside from the libreta, members wear a nickel ring that has the group's logo, something I've already hinted at before. The ring carries a significant meaning because it is supposed to warn the ring wearer of incoming danger. The ring also shows one's status in the group, which is, of course, hierarchical in nature. Furthermore, female members of the group are required to wear white dresses. If they are not from the Dinagat Islands already, they are heavily encouraged to go through so-called purification rituals performed by Ecleo Sr. himself. The group is also required to pray 8 times a day, at 6 and 9 in the morning, at noon, at 3 in the afternoon, at 6 in the evening, 9 in the evening, at midnight, and at 3 in the morning. Ecleo Sr. also apparently gave each of his chapter leaders healing powers that were supposed to enable them to cure the sick and bring back the dead. Moreover, he held so-called healing sessions on things like tooth extraction and acupuncture using an invincible needle. And so the group grew, and soon enough, the PBMA wielded the kind of power in the local region that would have local politicians come knocking at their door. After all, whoever was being endorsed by Ecleo and the PBMA was guaranteed at least 30,000 votes. For this reason, it was easy for both Moises Ecleo and Ecleo Sr. to also venture into local politics, as already indicated earlier. Now, by the time Ecleo Sr. died, the leadership of the PBMA was passed on to his son, Ruben Jr., who fancied himself a musician and a recording artist. But Ruben Jr.'s ascent to the throne, so to speak, would usher in a rather turbulent time for the PBMA, a group that until then lived in relative obscurity from the national consciousness and the media. When Ruben Jr., a former mayor of San Jose in Dinagat, took over the group, the PBMA saw a decrease in the numbers of followers, which I suppose would not be that surprising since any transition in leadership can lead to a bit of an upheaval in any type of organization. The Ecleos around this time were probably not too bothered anyway. With the loss of a few members, they, as a family, gained significant political hold and influence, with many family members running and winning local and even congressional elections. But the tides turned quickly when in 2002, news broke about Ruben Jr.'s wife Alona Bacolod Ecleo being found lifeless in a garbage bag in Cebu. This news would start a slow fall from grace for Ecleo Jr. that further led to not only a further decrease in PBMA membership numbers, but a continuous discreditation of the group in general in the eyes of the public. And it had all to do with Alona. So what happened to her? In the police investigation that started in January 2002, we learned that on the 9th of January 2002, a body was found at the foot of an 8-foot ravine in the town of Dalaguete in Greater Cebu. The body would be later identified as Alona. During the autopsy, it was concluded that Alona was badly beaten up and strangled, which was her direct cause of death. Having identified the body as Alona Bacolod Ecleo, her family was notified. The devastated family from the very beginning maintained that the only person who could have done this to Alona was her husband, Ruben Ecleo Jr. The police took this into consideration but took a whole 13 days to actually file charges despite having quite considerable evidence in the form of witness statements. We would learn that Alona's two brothers, Josbel and Ben Bacolod, as well as Forest Hills compound security guard Rodrigo Panelio, Guadalupe Barangay Tanods Jose Ulysses Bolayog and Andy Miñosa, as well as Alona's friend Arturo Samorin Jr. were also questioned as witnesses and were deemed credible. This is a story as it was pieced together by the police, mainly from Josbel, who I understand lived in a house adjacent to the house owned by the Ecleos in Banawa, Cebu. Full disclosure, I'm not actually sure how to properly pronounce the name of Alona's brother. It could be Josbel, it could be Josebel, but for now, I'm just going to go for Josbel just for ease. So Josbel claimed that on the night of the 5th of January, he was inside his room when he heard a noise coming from Alona's room, something he thought was rather alarming. He wanted to find out what was going on and went inside what was described as the main house, indicating to us that Josbel was somehow living in a separate unit but on the same property. He went to the kitchen and looked for water to drink. He then claimed that he was surprised to see some lights dimmed out and the main lights completely turned off in that house. He then said that he saw Ruben Jr. and he seemed restless to him. He was sweating heavily as well. Josbel described Ruben Jr. as then looking at him in an angry way, as if planning something wrong against him, like maybe hitting him. Josbel thought nothing of this at that moment, so he went back to his room, but he eventually felt quite bothered by Ecleo's behavior and went outside a second time around. And I think his instinct was right. This time he saw Ecleo Jr. and his driver, Juriven Padero, loading a big black rubbish bag into the trunk of a Toyota Corolla, presumably owned by Ecleo Jr. Now, this account by Alona's brother plus other witnesses potentially gave police enough probable cause to finally file murder charges against both Ecleo and Padero on the 22nd of January 2002. It also certainly helped that when the investigators were finally able to access the Ecleo home in Cebu, they found bloodstains on a plastic shower curtain, on a bedsheet, doorknob, and a floor mat. Additionally, the Toyota Corolla that was allegedly used by Ecleo and Padero was later discovered and checked for forensic evidence. The investigators found bloodstains in the trunk of the car, further solidifying the case theory the police had already more or less formed at that point. The only problem was that at this point, both suspects were in the wind and no one knew where they were hiding. Reports at that time claimed that both suspects fled to Surigao City from Cebu and were even escorted by a sergeant from the Armed Forces of the Philippines Central Command. By May the same year, the Philippine National Police were feeling the pressure of needing to apprehend the two men 5 months after the murder charges were filed. They said they enlisted the help of the military and spoke to Ecleo's lawyers and relatives. The lawyers then insisted that their client had never been on the run and was, in fact, staying in San Jose on Dinagat Islands, his and PBMA's hometown. I think it is safe to say at this point in the investigation that the loyalty instilled in PBMA's members truly came to the fore and was put to good use, especially when the police alleged that not only were local PBMA members protecting their leaders at all costs, but that there were bodyguards making sure that outsiders could not physically do anything to their so-called divine master. Ecleo's lawyers were not just sitting idle either, of course. Apart from maintaining that their client was never on the run, they also questioned the merit of the arrest order, a mere delaying tactic at this point, of course, in my opinion. But then again, it worked, because it did delay matters further. A month later, PBMA loyalty would be put to the test again, but this time in the most terrible way. On the 19th of June 2002, at around 5:35 in the afternoon, after efforts to convince Ecleo Jr. to surrender had failed, the Philippine National Police, with the help of the 20th Infantry Battalion of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, tried to serve Ecleo Jr. an arrest warrant. The scene in San Jose Dinagat was quite bizarre, as around 2,000 PBMA members formed a human chain around the Ecleo mansion to barricade the place and protect their divine master. In the eyes of the law, they easily had just committed an obstruction of justice of massive proportions. Now, this was when things got a bit precarious, though, in this story. Reports were and are still clear to this day that some armed PBMA members were the ones who opened fire first. The arrest team was then forced to return fire. What followed was a 3-hour firefight that would not easily be forgotten in the country's history. It was estimated that around 30 PBMA members opened fire at the police. These members were mostly part of Ecleo's elite security team called White Eagles. Now, one has to understand that this night was nothing short of awful surprises. Whilst the police and the military were trying to survive an assault on their units, the police in Mandaue City were about to get their own hands full at the same time. In Mandaue City, as it turned out, Alona's family had also become under attack. A man who was unidentified at that time opened fire at the Bacolod home with an Ingram pistol and an Uzi machine gun. Alona's brother, Ben, and their parents, Elpidio and Rosalia, were killed instantly. Ben's sister, Evelyn, and another brother, Ricky, initially survived the shooting, but Evelyn succumbed to her injuries later in a hospital. Ricky was still fighting for his life, and as per reports after that day, it looked like Ricky survived. Another survivor was Ben Bacolod's wife, Baby, who remained unhurt. The investigators in Mandaue City would soon get to interview witnesses who stated that apparently as soon as the family was initially injured by the automatic fire from the Uzi machine gun, the gunman proceeded to go near them, finish them off by shooting them in the heads one by one and at close range. The Mandaue police authorities would later confirm that indeed a fourth person had also died that night, but it was not someone who was part of the Bacolod family. Rather, it was their neighbor, Paterno Lactawan, who seemed to have died from the hail of bullets from the gunman's Uzi. This just shows that such vengeful or hateful crimes do not just affect the suspect's primary target or targets. The problem of stray bullets is very real and demands a close look at weapons possession laws and regulations within the Philippines, amongst many other things. Indeed, crimes like the one perpetrated on the Bacolods can easily spill and have spilled over, in fact, in this case, to an unknowing, innocent bystander. In any case, the Bacolod house, according to eyewitnesses, looked like a slaughterhouse in the aftermath of the shooting, with the dead Bacolod family members lying in pools of blood and shell casings littered just about everywhere. The police authorities in Mandaue made this case their absolute priority, and it paid off. They were very quick to track down the gunman who murdered the Bacolods, and it would come to no one's surprise that the gunman was a man named Rico Gumonon or Gumolon, a 28-year-old member of the PBMA and a security guard working in either Cebu or Mandaue. He was later killed during a shootout when the police tried to apprehend him. It is important to note that the attack on the Bacolods by a gunman who also just happened to be a member of the PBMA may not come too far from the left field, given the tension between anyone from the PBMA and anyone who was set on arresting their leader or bringing him down generally. However, the attack itself was a direct result of a call to arms by Ecleo Jr. himself. Now, just minutes before the attack on the Bacolods, Ecleo Jr. asked his followers to wage an all-out war on his enemies during a phone interview with a local radio station at around 9 o'clock in the evening. Ben Bacolod, before his untimely death, was a leading witness in his sister's case, as you may remember, and was considered by Ecleo Jr. as an enemy. Even the police knew that Ecleo was hell-bent on waging this war against those who he perceived as having wronged him, which of course included the Bacolods. And so just minutes after Ecleo concluded that radio interview, the gunman stormed the Bacolod home. Whether he was given direct order to do so or did so out of devotion and conviction for Ecleo and the PBMA, we will never know, but I believe the answer is somewhere between those two options. Let's now leave Mandaue and go back to San Jose on the Dinagat Islands. The police counted 16 dead PBMA members after the 3-hour shootout. Juriven Padero, Ecleo's co-accused, was one of the 16 who died. One police officer was killed as well. Needless to say, so many lives were unnecessarily lost and ended that night. And it was all because of one man, Ruben Ecleo Jr. By 9 o'clock the next day, the tides had turned yet again, and Ecleo surrendered. He was accompanied by his mother, Glenda Ecleo, his brother Benny, some close aides, and of course, his lawyer. 2 further PBMA members were also arrested, and several weapons were also confiscated. In the aftermath of the Dinagat shootout and the Mandaue massacre, many were left reeling and wondering why this had to happen or whether this could have been prevented. Please note that Ecleo Jr.'s mother, Glenda, was a congresswoman at that time who received many offers from her fellow politicians such as Senator Robert Barbers and Speaker Jose de Venecia to help with her son's surrender. In the end, it would seem that Glenda Ecleo never really considered the offers made by Barbers and de Venecia. The only thing she could say in the end was that apparently she had lost control of Ruben Jr. and also Ecleo's followers who were stopping him from surrendering. In a radio interview later, Ecleo Jr. explained that he expressed the intention to surrender to his followers way before the shootout started, but his followers actively stopped him from doing so. I somehow want to say that I find both notions unlikely, but then again, we are talking about a cult here. It is possible that Ecleo said what he said in that interview to perhaps minimize his culpability in this horrific shootout, but he failed to understand that even if a prosecutor did not find him in any way culpable for the shootout as a crime, he was very much still on the hook for Alona's death. In any case, Ecleo Jr. needed to face not only the charge in relation to his murdered wife, but also any charges in relation to the death of a police officer and the wounding of another one during the Dinagat shootout. He was also made aware that he would be charged with firearm-related offenses, as some of the weapons and explosives that were later confiscated from his home were considered at that time illegal under Philippine law. But without further ado, Ecleo Jr. was flown directly to Manila to face these charges and stand trial in the nation's capital. Or at least, that's what he thought at the beginning. Now, before I continue with that part of the story, I would like to perhaps discuss the question around the shootout and whether it was really necessary. Could the PNP have responded any other way despite being shot at first? Was there a way to de-escalate the situation? I would argue yes. I know that during that time, both the PNP big bosses and even then President Macapagal Arroyo were very willing to accept a bloody ending to this standoff. But I think once you give leeway or once you turn a blind eye to one thing and not the other, I think your principles can become easily corrupted or eroded. In my opinion, as someone who was not there at that time and as someone without police training, I would like to believe that there was an opportunity that night to disable the supporters through tear gas or cutting off their water and food supplies, or perhaps negotiating with them in order to avoid bloodshed. But of course, that is only an opinion, as I said. Now let us continue with our story. In light of Ecleo's extradition to Manila, some people were not happy that the PNP did not deem it important to have him detained perhaps on Dinagat Islands or Cebu or Mandaue, where the Bacolod family was murdered. The Volunteers Against Crime and Corruption, or VACC, was a very visible advocate of this cause, saying that Ecleo Jr. needed to face parricide and murder charges before a Cebu or Mandaue criminal court. Therefore, the VACC also took it upon themselves to file a complaint for murder against Ecleo Jr. Meanwhile, the Philippine National Police, or PNP, whilst basking in a mostly positive light following the shootout and arrest of Ecleo, were actually cleaning house as well. As it turned out, 2 police officers belonging to a precinct in the Caraga region were said to have acted like Ruben Ecleo's personal guests, staying in the Ecleo mansion in the middle of the manhunt for Ecleo instead of doing their job. I can safely assume that these 2 police officers have lost their jobs following this discovery. But the more important question is, what happened to Ecleo Jr. after he was extradited to Manila? After his arrest, he went through the same tests and procedures that all detained suspects do, which meant that he had to be tested for illicit drugs, amongst other things. It would come to no one's surprise that Ecleo Jr. tested positive for shabu, meaning he was high the whole time the shootout was taking place. This prompted the PNP to also lay drug charges on top of all the other charges of murder, attempted murder, and illegal possession of firearms. So the issue of Ecleo Jr. having used drugs was important because what we learned after the shootout and the murder of the Bacolods, including Alona, was that the Bacolod family had raised this issue of drug use before. The remaining Bacolod family members also raised this issue with the police even before the police tested Ecleo Jr. And now the family felt vindicated, knowing that they were right after all, and could be right about the rest, that Ruben Jr. had his own wife killed and her family in Mandaue as well. Ruben Ecleo Jr., on the other hand, was very firm in his statement that he had nothing to do with Alona's death, that he only heard about the Bacolods through news reports. He would also later say that he regretted what happened on the Dinagat Islands, that had he known things would go that way, he would just have surrendered. Make of that what you want, but I feel that he was just trying to damage control at this point, and he was attempting to sound sympathetic of the lives lost. Instead, I perceived him as rather disingenuous. And whilst Ecleo was busy worrying about his future, the Philippines legislators took this time to think of ways to avoid what happened on the Dinagat Islands. Some legislators were of the opinion that there should be a clampdown on fanatical groups, especially those who were or are known to have firearms and or explosives. They were of the opinion that the PBMA was by far not the first and last one who would use force and firepower to defend themselves. These legislators observed that several other groups, mostly from northern Mindanao, had done the same thing on a smaller scale, and the legislators were not wrong. At least 40 semi-religious or pseudo-religious groups rose to prominence in their respective towns when the government was in search of Mindanaoan allies in their fight against the NPA or the New People's Army. Some of these groups also had separatist sentiments or ideologies. The government, I can imagine, trained or at least provided weapons to these groups, and these groups have ended up exerting dominance in their towns and commanding the people's loyalty and respect. Any big government intervention now would feel very invasive. Now, moving our timeline to February 2003 now, we learned from several mainstream media outlets that having been arraigned for parricide for the killing of Alona, Ruben Ecleo Jr. refused to enter a plea for 1 whole year. In the end, the judge in this case needed to enter the plea for him, and as a matter of procedure, entered a not guilty plea. But Ecleo Jr. was not exactly silent or inactive in his case. He questioned the jurisdiction of the court in this case. The parricide case was going to be tried in Visayas and not Manila anymore, seeing as the crime took place in Mandaue. Needless to say, Ruben Ecleo Jr. was not happy about this new development. He was of the opinion that he should be tried in Manila. His petition to be transferred to Manila for this trial was unsuccessful, however. Now, please remember that the only charge and the only crime being processed at this point when it came to Ruben Ecleo Jr. was the parricide, i.e. the murder of Alona. As for the other charges against him, we learned that the cases in their respective courts were all still pending even a year after the tragedies in Mandaue and on Dinagat Islands. This was concerning. No one was being held responsible at all for the murder on the Bacolods and for the shootout, even though in my opinion there was enough to make an initial case against Ecleo Jr. The police authority responsible for the case relating to the Bacolods had all but given up and declared the case cold at this point. The shooter was dead, and he could not be questioned as to who ordered him to shoot the family or what motivated him to kill the Bacolods. However, and rather ironically, the chief of the CIDG, or the Criminal Investigation and Detection Group, expressed publicly that he was morally convinced that Ecleo Jr. was involved in the killing of the Bacolods, a statement that on the surface might initially seem appeasing, but is actually quite useless. In reality, the PNP was taking hit after hit from the media and the public over the lack of movement in the Mandaue case and the shootout case. A few times, the PNP were seen desperately fighting their corner, but in at least one news article, it sounded like the PNP themselves were losing steam in investigating both cases. They did not have many leads or witnesses. All they had really were testimonies from the surviving Bacolod family members, and the CIDG chief and the prosecutor knew that such testimonies were not enough to build a case. That case, if built at all, would easily fall apart. And so the waiting game for any new evidence or leads continued. By 2004, things shifted. Ecleo Jr. claimed that being detained was exacerbating some pre-existing medical conditions he had and that he would like to be released on bail. His lawyers made the application, but the Cebu City prosecutor, now the head prosecutor in this case, fought the bail application and filed a motion for reconsideration. Outside, the people started protesting as soon as they heard the news about the bail application. Their protest only grew louder when in April 2004, Ecleo's bail application was granted, releasing Ecleo on a ₱1 million bail. People were enraged, and the surviving Bacolods felt unsafe, and justifiably so. The prosecution did not stop at this point, though. They filed a petition before the appeals court by July 2004, and the following was written in one online news outlet about this specific action. Quote, "The prosecutors said, however, that the lower court's decision should be reversed for grave abuse of discretion. They said the records show evidence that Ecleo was not suffering from any serious illness. Ecleo is charged with a heinous crime and should be denied bail," the prosecutors said. They also complained that the lower court granted bail without a hearing. End of quote. In response, the Court of Appeals ordered Ecleo to respond to these scathing accusations by the prosecution. Now, bear in mind, he was already outside at this point, since ₱1 million was probably pocket change for the Ecleos anyway. I have to admit that my research into what happened next in this bail application saga turned out next to nothing. So I am operating under the assumption that the bail order was upheld by the Court of Appeals and Ecleo was able to walk free until his trial started. There is at least one reference that my assumption might be correct, but more to that later on. What you have to bear in mind as a listener right now is that this granted bail application would have severe repercussions further down the line in this particular case, and you will probably notice that later on as the story progresses. By October 2004, Ecleo Jr. tried his luck again in getting the case transferred to Manila, as he deemed Cebu to be too hostile towards him and perhaps too biased as well. I'm not sure why that would matter, since criminal cases in the Philippines are not jury trials, and the only person the defense lawyer had to convince in this case would be the judge. Luckily enough, the petition for transfer of venue was denied, as it was not deemed a danger or a threat for Ecleo to be tried in Cebu. And so the trial could finally begin. The trial court in Cebu, whose docket this was presented in, first and foremost issued a hold departure order to ensure that Ecleo did not abscond from the Philippines. He had wealth and therefore the means to escape the country if he wanted to. Specifically, the presiding judge also told Ecleo to stay in Cebu. Any move to any other region within the Philippines would cause a revocation of his bail, and that would be him risking a rearrest. Oddly enough, though, when this order was made, Ecleo was actually in Manila for a medical checkup, and so the judge in Cebu had to order him to not move from the address he was staying in Manila, and to also come back as soon as the medical checkup was over. Fair enough, but later on Ecleo was, despite all these apparent restrictions, still allowed to travel outside of Cebu, specifically back to the Dinagat Islands where he spent Christmas with his children. I suppose the court orders had provisos and exceptions, but from where I am sitting right now, they did not seem as effective as their authors hoped them to be, but I digress. When the trial finally started, the public and the Bacolods were confronted by information and details from 2 years ago that they all probably wanted to forget about already, but couldn't. People were reminded again that Alona's direct cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation. It showed that whoever killed her had a very personal reason and was perhaps close to her. As in all criminal trials in the Philippines, the trial dragged on, and soon enough we found ourselves in the year 2005. Right off the bat in January, the judge was in the hot chair when the media asked her if she was inclined to accept bribes from PBMA members. Judge Geraldine Faith Ekong, of course, denied she would ever take bribes from anyone, but she did confirm that attempts to bribe her had indeed been made. The issue was then cleverly taken by Ecleo's lawyers, who said that Ekong should recuse herself as the presiding judge because surely after these failed attempts at bribing her, her perception of Ecleo could not be unbiased anymore. What an odd way to argue this, and I'm not entirely sure I can follow the logic or would want to. A Cebu City Councilor, Gerardo Carillo, certainly understood this tactic better and speculated in an interview that, quote, bribe attempts were purposefully done to set the ground for Ecleo's lawyers to file a motion for Ekong's inhibition, hoping the Supreme Court would eventually decide to move the trial to Manila. In any case, Judge Ekong stated that she remained unfazed by any bribery attempts, and so far the defense had not filed any application to have her removed from the case anyway, so the trial needed to move along. It was very important for Judge Ekong that the trial would go as quickly as it could because she was already the sixth judge to handle the case after everybody else had to recuse themselves for one reason or the other. When this issue was finally laid to rest, more or less, the trial could move on, but just about. A new issue popped up. For some reason, the private prosecutors in the case asked the court to grant them an order to exhume Alona's body to confirm her identity. An odd order to ask for since Alona was formally identified already when she was first found in Cebu. The argument by the prosecution was that they needed to, quote, preclude all doubts as to the identity of the remains of the late Alona Bacolod Ecleo, end of quote. The proposed order described how there were plans to test her DNA to be sure it was really her. The defense was not too happy about this application and called it a delaying tactic, a bold statement from the lawyer of a client who resisted entering a plea for 1 whole year. Also, a bold statement from a lawyer who, in the first place, cast some doubt on the identity of the body found in the ravine in Cebu 3 years ago. And so the exhumation was granted in February 2005, and the process of identifying the body took until May of that same year. At this point, the allocated pathologist was due to appear in court, but almost did not make it after the defense tried to bar her over and over again from testifying. The defense was demonstrably trying hard to prevent first the exhumation, then the re-autopsy, and then the testimony of this pathologist, indicating to all of us really that whatever the pathologist was about to say at that point was always going to be negative for his defendant. With the presentation of this witness, the prosecution finally informed the court that they would be resting their case. It was now time for the defense to present their case or respond to the evidence as presented by the prosecution. However, there was a bit of a hitch at this point. It would seem that after the year 2005, the trial stalled quite a bit. After the prosecution rested their case, the online news outlets suddenly were very quiet. I could not find anything reliable between the years mid-2005 and late 2009. The only thing I could find was that Judge Ekong finally recused herself. All those same accusations that were thrown at her at the beginning of her time on this case finally got to her and made her realize that it was better to step back from the case than negatively affect it. And this was in 2008. During my research, I estimated that the case stalled for at least 1.5 to 2 years before 2009, which is where we need to pick up this case yet again. At this point, 7 years had passed, and the Bacolods were still waiting for justice. However, in 2009, not only would they be disappointed by the very slow turn of the wheels of justice in the Philippines, but also the absolute guts of some criminals. Let me explain. After the trial resumed with a new judge, and after it was back on track by the 14th of October 2009, Ecleo Jr. was nowhere to be found. He said he was sick and therefore could not attend court, but people were justifiably suspicious and also anxious. Could he have absconded already? One thing was guaranteed, however. Ecleo Jr.'s bail was being debated yet again, and the prosecution was attempting to get this revoked in light of Ecleo's absence from court. Whether this attempt at revoking his bail was successful or not was unclear from the online sources I had seen, but I am inclined to believe that Ecleo remained on bail for a very odd yet real reason that would soon be revealed in the Filipino summer of 2010. Now bear with me for a few moments here, because before we get to the summer of 2010, I want to go back to December 2003, and I promise I will be quick. Unbeknownst to most of the public, in December 2003, a person came forward with quite an accusation. I know that so many elements in this case have been surprising and confusing in equal measures already, and I'm sorry to add another bizarre element into this case. This person, named Cedric Divinadera, surfaced in General Santos in December 2003 and told the police authorities there that actually Ben Bacolod, Alona's now deceased brother, was in reality the mastermind behind his own sister's killing. His surfacing was a bit too well-timed, and the police there and the Bacolod family, of course, suspected him already to be a planted individual who was sent to potentially help Ecleo's case and confuse the prosecution at the same time. I will not get into the exact details of Divinadera's statement, but rest assured, he pointed his fingers at Ben, saying that in the course of essentially extorting money from his own sister Alona, he strangled and then killed her, and then placed her body in a rubbish bag, after which he dumped her into a ravine in Dalaguete in Cebu. Divinadera said that he was paid for his silence by Ben, but his conscience was bothering him and therefore he decided to surrender. The police found his version of events to be very scripted, but nevertheless, they decided to detain him. I am not sure if he was ever charged right away, but we now know that he was detained this whole time from 2003 until 2010, potentially without any charge. Now fast forward to March 2010, where I originally wanted to take you. The remaining Bacolod family members were informed that Divinadera was convicted and sentenced for being an accessory in the killing of Alona. Even the NBI were not aware that Divinadera was at all in court or that a case was being built and then filed against him, which I found really odd because the NBI had this man in custody for a very long time at this point. In any case, the sentencing of Divinadera was described as almost a cloak and dagger operation, with Divinadera being arraigned and sentenced all on the same day. Cedric de Vinadera, as it turned out, was sentenced to 4 to 8 years in prison after he apparently pleaded guilty following a plea agreement. This whole situation angered the Bacolods because they were and are sure that de Vinadera knew nothing about Alona's death. His guilty plea being accepted by the court signaled to the Bacolod family that the court believed their brother Ben was involved in Alona's death, something they vehemently denied from the very beginning. But the Bacolods knew that they could not invest any more time and emotional labor into this matter with Cedric de Vinadera because another storm was headed their way just a few weeks after. Lagim fam, I may need to look up the Commission on Elections closer because it is wild to me that in 2010, an election year, a defendant in a parricide trial was allowed to file for candidacy in a congressional election. Yes, Ruben Icleo Jr. ran for the congressional seat in the Lone District of Dinagat Islands and won against political rival Francisco Rojas Sr. Icleo Jr. essentially inherited this congressional seat from his mother Glenda, and it will not come to anyone's surprise that the majority of votes cast for Icleo were from PBMA members. Dinagat Islands, after all, are de facto their realm already. Now, the Philippines is one of very few democracies that allow people with proven criminal records to run for government positions or also allow politicians inside jail cells to actively campaign and run for key national and local government positions. As it stands, there's no national law preventing this. An ombudsman is the only fail-safe here in a way, and it is never guaranteed that they can prevent public officials from holding public office with or without a court conviction. The many ombudsmen in the government have managed to do so in some cases, but have also failed in some. And so this phenomenon shall continue until our legislators decide something needs to be done about it. I hope they can see that part of being in a democracy is demanding a high level of integrity from public officials, amongst other things. Being in a trial or in jail after a conviction and still being able to run for office seems to be the very opposite of having integrity. As for Icleo, after winning his congressional seat, he was prompted to head to the nation's capital and start his term. He attended the orientation seminar for new congressmen and started working as one from that point onwards, all whilst being on trial and all whilst being on bail. Just as a side note here, by the way, congressional representatives are not allowed to be detained for any reason whatsoever whilst Congress is in session. So Icleo Jr. was conveniently being protected by this provision that seems to make no sense at all in this context. However, protection from detention did not mean immunity from a trial. Icleo Jr. still needed to attend trial in Cebu and also give his testimony, as well as making himself available for cross-examination like any other defendant. Which then brings me to January 2011. Around this time, Icleo was due to give his testimony in his trial. He was also due to be cross-examined. It was interesting to read about the many times he managed to contradict himself or just say outrageous things. At one point, he confidently stated that he felt Alona was still alive. At another point, he testified that Alona told him how she was attending a post-New Year's party with her brother Ben on the 5th of January, just before she was found dead. But in an earlier statement, he was quoted saying that Alona was actually at a beach party, one that was not New Year's related at all. He also said that having noticed his wife being gone, he was not too worried because Alona disappeared like this all the time in the past. Of course, he maintained all throughout this process that he was innocent. Now, after this first session of cross-examination, the court ordered a recess and told all parties involved that another hearing would take place at the end of January 2011. Ecleo never attended that hearing, and the two other hearings after that, citing his health as the cause for his absence. Now, bear in mind that all of this was possible because of the bail that he received back in 2004. None of that was revoked, and he was never rearrested. From this moment onwards, we will see how the granted bail application from years ago would impact the trial now in 2011. Now, whether the excuses about his health were true or not, Ecleo was nevertheless granted everything that he needed when it came to his health. He asked for time off in order to undergo bypass surgery, and that was granted. Now, in retrospect, of course, a lot of people believe that Ecleo was never sick and there was never a necessity to travel to Manila or elsewhere for any surgery or medical treatment. However, in retrospect as well, people now believe that Ecleo knew he had to be absent and less visible to the public because of one specific reason. At this point in the trial, we would find out that he was actually being sought by the Sandigan Bayan, a court solely established for graft and corruption cases. As it turned out, Ecleo was also convicted around this time in a graft case. He was convicted for 3 counts of graft that he committed during his time as mayor in San Jose de Nagat Islands. When this all became clear to the criminal court in Cebu as well, it was decided that Ecleo needed to be rearrested, that his bail was now revoked. Ecleo Jr.'s lawyers promised to file a motion for reconsideration, as any good lawyer would do in this case, but they also admitted not knowing where their client was. Needless to say, the PNP was very determined to find Ecleo, and so a manhunt was started.
Makalipas ang 10 taon, nahatulang guilty sa kasong parricide si Congressman Ruben Ecleo ng Lone District ng Dinagat, Surigao del Norte. Ang PNP nagsasagawa na ng nationwide manhunt laban kay Ecleo, pero aminado ang pulisya, mahirap kumuha ng impormasyon tungkol sa kinaroroonan nito.
Any effort on the part of the PNP is always anchored doon sa magandang relasyon sa komunidad.
Bukod sa pagiging kongresista at miyembro ng isang political family, si Ecleo din ang Supreme President Master ng Philippine Benevolent Missionary Association, isang organisasyong itinatag ng kanyang ama.
By April 2012, more than 10 years after Alona was so brutally murdered in Cebu, Ruben Ecleo Jr. was found guilty of parricide and was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. Since Ecleo Jr. was still on the run at this point, he was not present during the reading of his verdict. Nevertheless, the process continued. He was ordered to pay 25 million pesos in compensatory damages to Alona's heirs. Furthermore, he was also ordered to pay Alona's family 200,000 pesos in moral damages, the same amount also in exemplary damages, and again 200,000 pesos in lawyer fees. Lastly, he was ordered to pay 50,000 pesos for temperate damages. As a side note here, he was also found guilty of graft by the Sandigan Bayan Court and was sentenced to 31 years in prison. So at this point, you might think to yourself, what did the PBMA members think of all this? Well, one member interviewed by the Inquirer said that the court's decision reaffirmed to many members the mission of their Supreme Master. The mission being to sacrifice himself so that their organization can become known worldwide. As one might expect, Ecleo, through his lawyers, brought his case to the Court of Appeals, filing a motion for reconsideration in the hope to get his verdict and sentence overturned, but this was denied. His lawyers then tried to file another motion in 2015, saying that there was a procedural error when the court needed to notify the defendant and lawyer about the promulgation of Ecleo's judgment. Just a quick explainer here. In a lot of countries with a similar judicial system as ours, handing down a verdict is a separate court date than the sentencing hearing. Both are usually straightforward, in which the judge reads out the verdict reached by him or a jury. The sentencing is the same. The judge will read out the sentence, allow victim impact statements in some countries, and add his own opinion to the matter. In the Philippines, both the defense lawyer and the defendant need to be separately notified about a so-called promulgation of judgment. This is taken very seriously, to the point that if done improperly, one of the remedies available to the convicted person is the possibility of a new trial altogether. I think Ecleo's lawyers were hoping this would happen because, according to them, Ecleo was never notified about the date and time of this specific promulgation. However, this application was also denied. So just you are reminded, despite the verdict, the sentence, and the appeals, this whole time Ecleo was on the run and was merely represented by his lawyer Orlando Salatandre, who had always denied knowing the whereabouts of his client. He said he only communicated with his client through the phone. And so the police's manhunt needed to continue. And how it continued.
Kung noon naging madugo ang pag-aresto kay Ruben Ecleo Jr., ngayon hindi raw lumaban ang dating politiko at supreme master ng isang religious group. Pero mariin pa rin niyang itinangging pinatay niya ang kanyang misis noong 2002. Ang aktwal na pagdakip kay Ecleo, tinutukan ni Marisol Abduraman, exclusive.
Hindi na nakapalagpa ang sakay ng van na ito nang harangin ng mga operatiba ng Regional Special Operations Group ng NCRPO sa San Fernando, Pampanga kaninang umaga. Ang pasahero, ang dating mayor, dating congressman at kinikilalang Supreme Master ng Philippine Benevolent Missionaries Association o PBMA, si Ruben Ecleo Jr.
The manhunt lasted close to 10 years. On the 30th of July 2020, after eluding arrest for almost a decade, Ruben Ecleo Jr. was finally arrested in Pampanga. It was not as if no one had heard from Ecleo in those years he was on the run. In fact, 3 years before his arrest, he made several statements about how he was willing to surrender on the condition that his two former lawyers, Salatandre and Giovanni Mata, be disbarred and that his case be reopened. This was, of course, a ludicrous request. Even more ludicrous was the intention to escalate his parricide case to the Supreme Court. On the other hand, the police were also now looking into how to tie in Ecleo to the Mandawi massacre now that Ecleo was in custody at last. So people from both camps, so to speak, were busy pursuing all these avenues to either redeem Ecleo or bury him further in years of jail time. But all these efforts would suddenly come to a grinding halt in May 2021.
Kapapasok lamang pong balita, pumanaw na ang isa sa itinuturing noon na most wanted ng bansa na si dating dinagat Congressman Ruben Ecleo Jr. Ayon kay Bureau of Corrections spokesman Gabriel Chaklag, bandang alas 12:20 kaninang tanghali nang pumanaw si Ecleo dahil sa atake sa puso. Nagpositibo raw siya sa COVID-19 pero tuluyang nakarecover higit 1 linggo na ang nakalilipas.
At 12:20 in the afternoon on the 13th of May 2021, spokesperson for the Bureau of Corrections, Gabriel Chaklag, announced that Ruben Ecleo Jr. had died at the New Bilibid Prison Hospital following a cardiopulmonary arrest. He had just recovered from COVID-19 a week before his death, but he had also suffered from obstructive jaundice, kidney disease secondary to obstructive uropathy, and thus ended the life of one of the most wanted men in Philippine history less than a year after he was arrested. He barely sat his sentence, which did not sit right with a lot of people. It was Ecleo's arrest that reignited my interest in this case after being fascinated by it in the past. I was pleased to see him arrested, finally, but to hear that he barely sat a year of his life sentence made me think of the Bacolod family. It made me think of Alona, the dead police officers, and even the PBMA members who lost their lives during the shootout on Dinagat Islands. All for a man who grew up believing he was divine and untouchable. All for a man who believed that he did not owe anybody an explanation, let alone remorse, for his crimes. A man who was able to live a free life in Pampanga whilst the Bacolods were in agony for almost 2 decades. And only for this man to die a mere 10 months into his sentence. The unfairness of it all seems extra cruel, especially when I think about what Alona could have become. She was on her way to become a doctor. Her presence in this world would have been such a positive force, but instead, she was taken, along with her family. I somehow just wish that the Bacolods know that we wish them well and we wish them a quiet life from here on out. They deserve it and they should have it. Lagim fam, what a roller coaster ride yet again. I initially thought I had to split the episodes, but I decided against it in the end. Again, I want to thank you for keeping up with this roller coaster ride. If you have any questions, any suggestions, or feedback, please let me know on Instagram. If you have made it this far, by the way, congratulations. Also, if you have time, do make sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and also Spotify. If you are not following us on social media yet, please do so. I always keep you updated through Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter as well. All the links to those things that I've just mentioned are in the show notes. If you like this podcast and if you've learned something new from today's episode, please consider supporting my podcast by making a one-off donation through buymecoffee.com or by using the affiliate links for Shopee and Lazada. All the links are also in the show notes. Again, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, maraming salamat at mabuhay.